The bond-rite candles were already lit when Marin reached the servants' passage. She knew this not by sight, but by sound. The low, ceremonial register that came through the stone in waves, a cadence she associated with funerals and the closing of things. Her fingers found the keyhole without light. The key Wren had pressed into her palm not 20 minutes past turned smoothly, and Marin stood with her hand still on it and did not push the door open. Inside that room, Lady Sarah stood at the dais where she had no business standing. Inside that room, Elder Kareth read the words that would seal a bond and close every threshold Marin had been careful not to name since autumn. The court of Darkhollow watched, and the court approved, and the court had never once looked at the woman standing in the servants' passage with her back against the cold stone and her ear pressed to the wood. She had not come to stop it. She told herself this, firmly and again. She had come because Wren had handed her the key and said, soft and direct in the way Wren always was, "He is asking for you, not with words, but he is." And Marin, who had spent 90 days learning exactly what Hadrian Darkhollow sounded like when he meant something and could not say it, had not been able to answer. She pressed her ear closer to the wood and listened for his voice inside the ceremony's cadence. She found it, low and still and utterly alone in the middle of all that ritual sound. She knew his voice now the way you know the specific pitch of a struck bell. She knew what it sounded like when he was tired. She knew what it sounded like when he was lying. What she heard now was neither. And it was that, more than anything, that had brought her here. What she did not yet know was how she had arrived at a servant's passage in the Darkhollow court, holding an iron key on a solstice night, 3 months after she had been assigned to read his mail. 3 months earlier, in the last week of autumn, the Alpha King of Darkhollow had come home without his eyes. The word that reached the court ahead of him said, "Silver-laced arrow, border engagement," 7 days before the healers could extract the wound's residue. The healers said it differently in private. Silver toxin at the wound's edge suppressed the lycanthropic regeneration that would otherwise have restored him within days. Temporary, they said. No certain end to the temporary. The council heard temporary and said nothing, and what the court felt in the silence that followed was not grief, but the very particular calculation of men who have been waiting for an opening. Marin heard all of this from the kitchen corridor, where she had pressed herself flat against the wall to let a senior steward pass. She was 23 and held the posting of hall reader, a minor clerical function given to daughters of disgraced lords who needed occupation and cost nothing to keep. The posting meant reading correspondence aloud to whoever required it, petition letters and trade ledgers and border dispatches, in exchange for a room above the kitchens and a seat at the lower table, and the general presumption that she would say nothing worth repeating. She had held it for 7 months. In 7 months, she had spoken with any regularity to exactly 3 people. The senior steward, who called her function rather than her name. Wren, who had been her closest companion since they were girls in the village of Crestfall, and who had come to Darkhollow the same year, through the kitchen rather than the hall. And the late Lord's archivist, who was 91 and nearly as invisible as she was. Wren found her that evening at the water cistern near the lower corridor, which was where Wren always found her when something was happening that Marin needed to know before it happened to her. "They're calling a full council session," Wren said. She kept her voice close. She had learned early how to do that, the way you learn the temperature of water before you step into it. "Tonight." "I know," Marin said. The senior steward had come to the reader's closet, a narrow room off the second-floor hall where correspondence was sorted, and told her the council required the hall reader's attendance to document proceedings. She had not understood at the time why her skin had pulled tight in her chest at the word "required." She understood it 3 hours later. The council hall seated 30 on the tiered benches and held 40 witnesses at the back, and when Marin came through the scribe's door, it was already full. Elder Kareth stood at the dais in his senior crimson, the winter weight of it, and his voice carried without effort. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning the specific dimension of every room he entered and filling it exactly. Hadrian Darkhollow sat in the low council chair. The throne was raised. Steps presented a difficulty that neither he nor anyone present would name. He sat with his hands flat on the chair arms and his face angled toward the sound of Carath's voice, and his eyes, which were open, did not track the assembled court. The wound cloth was gone. In its place, nothing visible. Only a stillness that was not stillness at all, but the management of every remaining faculty brought to bear on compensating for the one now absent. Carath was speaking about stability. "The realm requires a clear succession chain," he said. "The border campaign has demonstrated the cost of a solitary line. The council has, in consultation with allied houses, identified a bond right as the most prudent mechanism for the period of recovery." He said, recovery, the way men said temporary, when they were not certain it would be. He said, prudent, the way men said necessary, when the decision had already been made. And he said the name Lady Sarah with the precise warmth of a man who had been practicing that particular sentence. The court received it in silence, not the silence of opposition, the silence of people who had completed the arithmetic. Hadrian's hands had not moved. "The hall reader," Carath said, and something in the turn of his attention made Marin look up from her notation. "Will document proceedings and provide reading services for the duration of His Majesty's incapacity. She is well suited to a temporary function." He said it the way you set an object on a shelf. Without malice. Without regard. The hall reader. A temporary function. The phrase landed and was absorbed, the way phrases about unimportant things are absorbed, and Marin wrote it in her notes in her own careful hand, because her function required a record. She made no mark on her face. At the council chair, Hadrian said nothing. His head had turned, very slightly, in the direction of the scribe's table. She told herself it was the sound of her writing stylus. She believed most of it. The sessions began 3 days later. The senior steward showed her the reading chamber adjacent to the king's private study. No window, one decent fire, correspondence in sealed stacks on the table. He said she was to read plainly, without omission, and ask no questions that were not strictly necessary. She had been reading plainly for 7 months. She settled into the chair and waited. When Hadrian came through the connecting door, she stood, and he said, without preamble, "Sit down." She sat. He found the chair by touch alone, a gesture so controlled it was not until later that she realized she had held her breath watching it. He said, "The border correspondence first. The Solon letter." She found it, broke the seal, and read. The Solon letter was a diplomatic offer that was not, on close reading, a diplomatic offer. It was a series of requests framed as concessions, each structured so that refusal would look like aggression. She read it word for word, the way she had been trained, and set it flat on the table. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might have gone somewhere else in his mind. Then he said, "Read it again. This time, tell me what it says beneath the words." She looked at the letter. She looked at the fire. The steward had been very specific. The steward was not in the room. "They want the Eastern Mill," she said. "The rest of the concessions are dressed to make that one look reasonable by comparison. If you agree to the framing of any of the subclauses, the mill transfers automatically under the annexed trade protocol. The mill is worth approximately 4 times the sum they name on the 3rd page." Silence. She had said too much. She began to reach for the next letter. "The Varon petition," he said. 3rd stack. She found it. She read it. He asked her again what it said beneath the words, and this time she answered without the pause. They worked for 2 hours. At the end he said, "Tomorrow. Same time." Not a question. She was at the connecting door when he said, "The hall reader." A pause. What is your name? She turned. He was looking at the table where the letters sat, or inclining his face in that direction, which was the more accurate thing. Marin, she said. He nodded once. Marin. He said it as though placing it somewhere specific, in some part of himself that held things he intended to keep. Wren was waiting at the kitchen stairs with a wrapped piece of bread from the lower table, and the expression she wore when she had already decided to say something and was choosing the moment for it. Well? Wren said. He is not what I expected, Marin said. She took the bread. Wren waited. This was one of the things Marin had always valued in her. She waited not as a tactic, but because she understood that some sentences needed to be reached from inside. He reads people, Marin said after a moment. Or he did. Now he listens to them instead. The result seems similar. Wren said. Is that going to be a problem? It was exactly the right question. Marin ate her bread and climbed the stairs and did not answer it, which was also an answer. The sessions continued. A pattern established itself. Sealed correspondence first, border reports second, council documents third if there was time. He rarely asked for council documents. The council documents were written by people who knew he would be listening to them read aloud, and they were structured accordingly, which is to say, they were impeccable and revealed nothing. If you read between the carefully composed sentences, they were a different document entirely, but that was interpretation, and she had been told not to. On the 11th day, he said, You hesitate on some of the letters. She had not been aware that she hesitated. Do I? A fraction, before you break the seal. Not all of them. His face was turned toward the fire, the way it turned when he was thinking rather than listening. Which ones? She looked at the day's stack. She knew which ones. The letters that had come through Karath's office before reaching the reading chamber, the seals slightly compressed in the reset. The ones that have been opened and resealed, she said. He was quiet. Then, show me. She carried the topmost letter to his side of the table. She took his hand because there was no other way to do it, and she did not let herself think about that. She placed his fingertip at the seal's edge, where the wax had been compressed in the reapplication. He moved his finger along the break with the precision of a man reading for specific information. How many of the last 11 days? He said. 6, she said. She was still holding his hand. She was holding it by the wrist at a slight angle so the light fell correctly. She released it when she registered this. He said nothing about it. He said, Keep a separate record, note each one. She returned to her chair. The fire settled. Neither of them addressed what she had held. On the 13th day, Elder Karath came to the corridor outside the reading chamber before her session began. He was cordial. He had the manner of a man who understood cordiality as a form of architecture, something you built around a conversation to determine its shape in advance. The hall reader, he said, and the way he said it placed her, cleanly and completely, in her designated position. I trust the king finds the arrangement satisfactory. I believe so, she said. Good. He smiled, which did not move his eyes. You understand the delicacy of the current period. Your role is support. Reading, notation, accuracy, not interpretation. She held her satchel with both hands. Of course. I mention it, he said, because I understand you are a perceptive woman, Lord Crestfall's daughter. He let that rest between them for a moment, the way a man sets down a weight when he wants the other person to feel its mass. Your father was a perceptive man as well. Perception, in court service, must be carefully directed. He moved on. She watched him go. The walk of a man who has been in every room he is entering for 30 years. She thought, her father's name in his mouth. She thought, carefully directed. She went into the reading chamber and sat down and waited for Hadrian, and she was careful, very careful, not to let her hands shake before he arrived. 3 weeks into the winter sessions, Hadrian asked for the border maps. She did not know how to read a map to someone who could not see it. There was no instruction in her function for this. She stood at the spread vellum for a moment, looking at the colored ink of the territory lines, and then she said, "I am going to need your hand." He came around the table to her side. She was aware, as she was always aware now in this chamber, of the precise degree to which he moved without sound. She placed her fingers over his and guided them to the northern border line, tracing the contour of the Solon claim against the dark hollow boundary. "Here," she said. "This is where they have moved the marker, 3 points east of the treaty line." His hand stilled under hers. She felt the quality of his attention in that stillness, the concentrated precision of it, and then he said, "Show me the mill." She moved his hand south, down the river line, to the small square at the water's edge. She held her hand over his longer than was strictly necessary for accuracy, because she was trying to find the right words for the geographic relationship between the treaty boundary and the mill, and when she looked up, his face was turned toward her rather than toward the map. He could not see her face. He was reading the sound of her breathing. She finished the explanation and stepped back. He did not move immediately. He left his hand resting where she had placed it, on the map's edge, and she understood that he had heard the step back and measured it. "You know this territory," he said. "I grew up near Crestfall," she said, "on the southern edge of the mill district." He was quiet. Then, "The Crestfall condemnation order. Is it in the correspondence?" She looked at her satchel. She knew the answer. She had seen it 2 days ago, sealed with Karath's office mark, and she had set it aside because she had not known, at the time, whether she could read it plainly and without omission. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the narrow room above the kitchens with the shutter gap letting in cold air, and Wren came and sat with her for a while without speaking, which was precisely what she needed. Then Wren left, and Maren sat alone with the fact of tomorrow until the watch change bell rang. She read it straight through. The Crestfall condemnation order named 12 families. The Alara name was fourth. The order cited seditious record-keeping, interference with council redistribution protocols, and willful misrepresentation of land title. It was dry language, the kind of language that sounded bureaucratic until you understood that the 12 families named in it had lost their land and their legal standing and their right to petition the crown. Until you understood that seditious record-keeping was the phrase used for her father's accounting of land that Karath's council allies had reclassified, and that the reclassification had consolidated approximately 400 acres into holdings that were already considerable, and that her father had been 2 weeks from presenting the accounting to a neutral arbitration body when the order arrived. She read it in the voice she used for all the correspondence. Flat, clear, accurate. She did not stop. She did not let it waver on the Alara name or on the phrase willful misrepresentation, which was the polite word for liar. When she finished, the reading chamber was very quiet. Hadrian had not moved in the last 3 minutes of the reading. She had tracked this without meaning to, the way she tracked everything in this room now. The position of his hands, the angle of his head, the quality of his stillness. He was not in the managed stillness of the listening posture. He was in a different kind of stillness, the kind that is not management, but attention, the kind that costs something to hold. "Maren," he said. She set the document flat on the table. She smoothed it once with her palm, which she had not intended to do, and she stopped. "The land redistribution cited in that order," he said slowly. "Who holds those parcels now?" It was not a question he was asking because he did not know. She understood that. It was a question he was asking because he wanted to hear what she would say. "Elder Karath's allied families," she said. "Primary allocation to the Varan and Solon holdings. The accounting is in the trade ledger from 4 winters past, third quarter. The silence changed in temperature. He moved, and what he did was not what she expected. He reached across the table, across the distance she had always kept carefully maintained, and his hand landed on hers where she had smoothed the document. One breath. He caught himself. She felt it in the slight tension that moved up his arm before he withdrew. He pulled his hand back and turned his face toward the fire, and neither of them spoke. She did not know what she was feeling, but she knew, with more precision than she wanted, what she had just read in him. She had spent weeks learning every small movement in this room. What she had just witnessed was a man who had reached toward someone, registered what he was doing, and stopped himself from completing it. The door opened. Doran stood at the threshold, broad-framed, a report in his hand. His eyes moved across the room in 3 quick passes: the king, the table, Marin's hands, and then back to the king. She gathered her papers. "I will leave you," she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that at least. She walked to the door and Doran stepped aside, and as she passed him she felt that he was not looking at her at all, but at the place at the table where Hadrian had not moved, and that Doran's particular silence had the quality of a man who had suspected something for weeks, and was now, having seen it with his own eyes, certain. She did not look back. The reading sessions did not stop. She had half expected some instruction to arrive through the steward in the days after Doran stood at the door and took his accounting of the room. None came. The letters arrived each morning at the reader's closet. The fire was laid each afternoon in the chamber. Hadrian came through the connecting door at the same hour with the same controlled economy of movement and said nothing that differed from what he had said before. What changed was the cold. The winter had deepened in the last weeks, and the smaller fires in the palace's interior rooms could not always keep pace with it. One afternoon she looked up from a border petition and realized she had moved her chair forward without noticing, drawn toward the heat, which put the edge of her shoulder less than a foot from his. She recognized this and did not move again. Moving now would make it legible in a way that staying still would not. He said, without turning, "The Solon arbitration letter." She found it and read. The cold did not change. The distance between them stayed at its new, unremarked measurement, and neither of them addressed it. And that, too, was a kind of conversation she had become fluent in without intending to. 3 sessions later, he stopped her near the end of an afternoon, when the light had gone, the particular gray that meant evening was close. He said her name, and then held the silence long enough that she set the letter down and waited. He moved his hand to the table's edge, the posture she had learned to read as a man selecting words with more care than the sentence would eventually permit. "The sessions," he said. Then he paused. He angled his face very slightly toward her, a fraction, the careful choosing of a door. "They have been necessary," he said. The word necessary landed in the room and carried a different weight than it usually did. She understood, from the quality of the silence that followed, what he had meant to say, and had set down unfinished instead. She had spent 80 days learning the precise difference between words he chose and words he used in place of what he meant. "They have been," she said. He drew one breath, slowly. Then he said the true thing rather than the real one. "Tomorrow." The Solon response requires drafting. She collected the day's letters. She walked to the connecting door, and he did not turn, and she left him in the cold chamber with the small fire and the sentence he had not finished. She went down to the kitchen corridor and sat on the step with her satchel across her knees and held the fact of that unfinished sentence the way you hold something you cannot put down and have not yet decided what to do with. Wren came with a cup of something hot and sat beside her without asking. "It is getting harder," Marin said. She meant the letters. She meant 80 days of learning a man's quality from the inside of his silence and finding it to be exactly what she had, against all her better judgment, begun to believe it was. "I know," Wren said. I do not know what to do with this, Marin said. Ren was quiet for a moment. Then, I think he doesn't either. Not the comforting answer. The honest one. Marin drank the cup down and climbed the stairs and lay in the narrow room above the kitchen with the shutter cracked to the winter air, and thought about a sentence without an ending until the watch change bell rang. 3 days later, Elder Karath came to the second-floor corridor outside the reading room at the hour when the stewards carried the afternoon correspondence up to be sorted. He was not alone. 2 council clerks accompanied him, and the senior court scribe who handled formal administrative changes, and the corridor itself was occupied. 2 household officers moving through on their own business, a senior maid at the linen closet, a junior steward at the far end. Karath had chosen his hour with the same precision he brought to everything. "The hall reader," he said. His voice carried the corridor's full length. The household officers slowed. The court scribe opened his folio. Kareth produced a document with the council seal fresh on it. He held it at an angle she could read. Her father's name, Ilara, disgraced, in the classification column. He said, with the measured warmth of a man delivering institutional fact to an institutional record, "A member of a family under active condemnation order is ineligible for access to Crown correspondence under the Council's household protocol. Your assignment was an administrative oversight. The correction is as follows. Service concluded this evening. Accommodation through the fortnight. As a courtesy." He said it in front of witnesses. Without heat. Without the slightest visible relish. The bureaucratic composure of a man who has spent 30 years understanding that you do not need malice when you have protocol. She did not touch the document. She looked at his face for a moment, at the precise composure of it, and she understood fully for the first time what her father must have seen in the last weeks before his own removal. Not anger, not cruelty, but management. The careful filing of inconvenient things. "Of course," she said. He turned and moved away, and the clerks followed, and the scribe made his notation and followed too, and the corridor became ordinary again as though nothing had been set in motion. She went into the reading room. She sorted the letters that were no longer hers to read. She removed from her satchel the separate records she had kept. 17 flagged letters dated over 11 days in her own hand, and she set it on the table where Hadrian would find it when he came through the connecting door. She picked up her satchel and walked out. The day passed in the particular wait of days when the worst has already arrived, and you are waiting only to understand the shape the consequences take. Word reached the kitchen corridor that evening. The bond rite with Lady Sarah was confirmed for the solstice night. The ceremony was 3 nights hence. She helped Ren carry the kitchen trays in the mornings. She spent the afternoons in the old archivist's room among the maps, where the cold was manageable and no one required anything. On the evening of the second day, Ren came to the kitchen doorway and pressed an iron key into her palm. Small, squared, a passage door key, not a hall door. "He is asking for you," Ren said, close and direct, the way she always said the things she had decided to say. Not with words. Marin looked at the key. She thought about a man at a map table with his hand resting where she had placed it, and a cold chamber with the distance between their chairs finally audible, and a sentence that had stopped before the word he had meant to say. She thought about reading a condemnation document in a flat voice while grief held absolutely still inside her chest, and the silence that had followed, and what he had registered in it. She thought about his hand reaching across the table and catching itself. She closed her hand around the key. Now she was back at the door in the passage, the key already turned, the bond rite candles giving their warmth through the gap below the wood. The ceremony's cadence had not yet reached the binding clause. She pushed the door and came through into the column alcove at the hall's far side. The full court occupied the benches. Lady Sarah stood at the dais step with her hands composed at her sides, attended and prepared. Elder Karath held the ceremony scroll at the speaking position, his voice in the low measured register of a ritual rehearsed until it was the same as breathing. 30 witnesses sat along the benches. Hadrian stood at the dais' edge. She looked at his face in the candlelight and saw what she had not expected and could not have predicted. His eyes were moving. Slowly, in the incremental searching pattern of a sight partially returned, reading the room's candle positions, finding the dais' edge. 90 days, and the silver toxin was clearing at last. He was not whole, not yet. He was no longer absent. Karath reached the third seal phrase, the ceremony's final approach to the binding clause. Stop. The hall held its breath. Karath's voice stopped with the phrase incomplete. Lady Sarah's hands shifted once and stilled. No one on the benches moved. There is a matter of record, Hadrian said, that requires address before this ceremony proceeds. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, worn at the crease. Her record. 17 letters in her hand, dated over 11 days. He held it steady in the Bond-Rite candlelight, and what it cost him was visible only in the slight set of his jaw and in the way his hand had tightened on the dais rail and then, deliberately, released it. He was forfeiting the council's political alliance. He knew it, and every member of the council present knew it, and he stood at the dais edge with his sight half returned and his posture unchanged. Elder Karath, the council correspondence passed through your office before reaching the reading chamber. 17 letters, resealed after examination. Among them the Varan Land Survey, the Solon Trade Annexure, and the Crestfall Condemnation Supplement. The reading chamber record documents each one. He turned his face toward the council benches, toward the approximate position of Karath's chair. Would the elder address it? Karath said precisely, "The king is still recovering. The strain of ceremony may cloud judgment." Marin, Hadrian said, her name in the hall's center. In front of the court and the candles and the full assembled witness of Darkhollow, her name said in the same voice he used for things he had decided to keep. She came out of the alcove. She walked the length of the hall along the column line, and the court turned as she came. Gray-blue wool, the satchel strap across her shoulder, the daughter of a disgraced lord crossing the ceremony floor without invitation, without hesitation, the full length of the stone between her and the dais. When she reached the dais step, he extended his hand without looking down, because he could not yet look down with full precision, and she took it. His fingers closed around hers. He held it before the court for long enough that every witness in the room understood what they were being shown. The hall did not breathe. "The Crestfall condemnation order is void," he said. "The land redistribution enacted under it is reviewed for reversal. The Alara family's standing is restored from this night." He paused. "Lady Sarah is released from this ceremony with all honor. Elder Karath will stand before independent review at the spring assembly to address the correspondence record." He said none of it to Marin. He said it to the hall, to the court, to the institution that had named her a temporary function in this same room and been wrong. Lady Sarah had already stepped back from the dais step, quietly and without spectacle, a composed efficiency that Marin could not help but notice. She moved among her attending women, and her women closed around her, and her face carried nothing that could fairly be called hatred, only the expression of someone who has just understood that the room she entered was never the one she had been told she was walking into. Karath stood at the speaking position with the ceremony scroll still in his hands. He said nothing. His composure held. Beneath it, in the slight recalibration around his eyes, was the expression of a man who has been the gravity in every room he entered for 30 years and is standing now in a room that has organized itself around someone else entirely. Doran was at the hall's rear, arms folded, his face carrying the settled look of a man whose certainty has finally been confirmed by something other than his own observation. Ren stood at the servant's door. She should not have been there. She had come anyway. Her hands were folded in front of her apron, and her face was open and entirely without performance. The same face she had worn since they were children in Crestfall, looking at Marin with the uncomplicated gladness of someone who has been waiting a long time for the world to see correctly. The spring assembly came 6 weeks after the solstice. By then, the silver toxin had cleared fully, and Hadrian moved through the hall with both eyes tracking the room, and Marin had learned what his face looked like when it was not compensating for absence. More present in the places she had expected distance, more careful in the places she had expected severity. The independent arbitration produced its findings before the assembly convened. 12 weeks of correspondence review had recovered, among the council's stored records, the original accounting her father had been preparing 11 years ago, the one he had been 2 weeks from delivering to a neutral arbitration body when the condemnation order arrived. It was meticulous, dated, naming each parcel transfer and the council proxies who had signed the reclassifications on private instruction from Carath's office. The arbiters laid it before the full council without comment. The document presented itself without assistance. Elder Carath was stripped of his council seat in the same hall where he had called her a temporary function, before the same witnesses. He was not imprisoned. He was diminished, which for a man who had built 30 years of authority on the management of every threshold he crossed was the precise form of consequence the room required. He walked out under his own power, and the court watched him go, and not one voice was raised in his direction. Hadrian voided the condemnation order from the dais with the council's formal attestation beside him, and the document that had carried 12 family names, including the Alara name, was removed from the active archive. The old archivist made the notation in his steady hand, and no one in the hall made any ceremony of it, which was exactly right. When the assembly concluded and the hall cleared, Marin stood for a moment at the threshold she had first crossed 7 months ago in gray-blue wool with a satchel, and the settled understanding that she would say nothing worth repeating. She had been wrong about that. Ren stood near the scribe's door, the same door Marin had come through on the first evening the council met to discuss a king's incapacity and a hall reader's function. Ren met her eyes across the stone floor and smiled the smile she had been offering since Crestfall. And then she turned and went through the door without speaking, and her footsteps faded into the corridor beyond, and the hall was quiet. Marin walked its length. The spring light came through the high windows in long angled bars, warming the stone in strips, the air holding the first quality of something other than winter. She walked past the column where she had stood in shadow on the solstice night, and past the bench tier where 30 witnesses had turned to watch her come, and past the place on the floor where her father's name had been said like furniture to close a door. She came to the dais. The throne chair stood at its center, the steps unobstructed. She did not go up the steps. She came to the dais's foot and set her hand on the carved stone arm of the throne chair, the right arm, where the morning light had been falling for the last hour. The door behind her stood open, as it had stood every morning since the solstice. The stone was warm,